Let's stay in the capital. It could be a matter of hours or days before disgraced former Paralympian Oscar Pistorius knows if he will be released on parole. It's been 10 years since he murdered his model girlfriend, Reeva Steenkamp. The Steenkamp family is opposing the possibility of his release. eNCA reporter Heidi Giokos is watching this, and she joins us now live for an update. Heidi, you've spent most of the day at the Kgosimampuru Correctional Centre there in Pretoria. What's happened there so far?
Yes, so what we do know so far, Masego, is that the Steenkamp family have left this correctional service centre here in Atteridgeville. What we do know is that June Steenkamp, who is the mother of the late Reeva Steenkamp, made representations before the parole board. This, of course, is part of the parole process. We do know that Oscar Pistorius, who was convicted of murder after having shot at his then partner Reeva Steenkamp 4 times back in 2013, is eligible for parole because he has served 8 years of his 13.5 years sentence, and this of course makes him eligible for that parole. What we do know is that June Steenkamp made representations before the parole board indicating that she opposes the parole of Oscar Pistorius. The reason for this is because the Steenkamp family believe that they still do not know why Oscar Pistorius shot their daughter. They believe that he was not truthful when he was on trial and explained what happened that day on the 14th of February 2013. The Steenkamp family also believe that when his initial conviction of culpable homicide was granted and then appealed to eventually murder, they feel as though he then also had an opportunity to explain what really happened, and they feel as though he has not done so. They've of course had to live with this tragedy, and it was of course very difficult for June Steenkamp. She had told the media very briefly that she was very nervous because she thought that she was going to have to face Oscar Pistorius today, but what we were told was that they were not in the same room. She did not have to face him today. The representations were basically separated. So after June Steenkamp presented her reasons why she's opposing parole and how life really has been after her daughter was tragically murdered like that, she was then asked to leave. They have since left, and we do know that Oscar Pistorius is now making representations before the parole board. Let's listen to what a family representative, together with the lawyer of the Steenkamps, indicated after their whole engagement before the parole board. Let's listen to that.
That they've spoken to June separately, and then we were excused, and they will now speak to Oscar separately. So we have been advised that there will be a decision later today. It was very unpleasant for her, the circumstances, but she knew that she had to do it for Reeva, and she did it, and I'm very proud of her. And sorry.
No, it's okay.
And she's very relieved that it's over.
You can imagine her anxiety knowing she's driving to physically see for the first time since 10 years ago the man who killed her daughter. But Heidi, how does this process work? What happens after today?
Yes, so very crucial question, because there's much confusion as to whether or not Oscar Pistorius will be released today if he is granted parole. But let's just provide some context about how this whole process works. So Oscar Pistorius was convicted of murder. He was granted 13.5 years, rather sentenced to 13.5 years. He has served half of that, which means he is by law eligible for parole. He will then sit before a parole board. A parole board will look at all representations and reports. So they will look at how Oscar has been performing in prison, if he has, if there have been any issues, if he has been rehabilitated in any kind of way. They will look at all of that. They will also look at the issues around what the victim's family has presented before them. As we just heard from the family's legal representative, they do not believe as though he has been rehabilitated because he has not given them the full version of what truly happened. But that's not necessarily how the law works. The law works in terms of if you have not been handed down a life sentence, you are then obviously eligible for parole, and that sits before the parole board, and whatever decision is made by the parole board, that is the final decision, because he was not given a life sentence, which means that decision will not go to the Minister of Justice. We are currently showing you some slides of how the parole system actually works. I think what's also crucial here is the fact that you don't have a situation where, or rather you might have a situation rather where we're not sure what his parole conditions will be like. So he might even still be under some form of house arrest. I don't think that's the actual term, but it's more of a parole system. It's a correctional supervision where you might have certain conditions attached to your parole. So perhaps he might not be able to perform as a Paralympian. We're not exactly sure how that process will work if he still wants to do that. There might be conditions attached to his parole system, but if he is granted parole, we'll just have to wait and see how that whole process works, or he might not have strict conditions attached to this. But at the end of the day, if he is out on parole, he still needs to serve his remaining years in some form or way, which means there might still be some kind of condition attached to all of this. Sinabako Nxumalo, who is the spokesperson for correctional services, did try and explain to us how this process works. They look at how Oscar Pistorius has been performing. They also look at timeframes. They look at whether or not you are eligible. And they have emphasized time and time again that Oscar Pistorius is indeed eligible for parole. Whether or not that decision is going to be made today, we're not sure if it's been made yet. We're not sure when it will be made. It might still be a couple of days, weeks, even months. We're not exactly sure how long the parole board will take to make this decision. We're not even sure if Oscar Pistorius is still presenting before the parole board or if indeed he is done. But that in a nutshell, Masego, is how the parole system works. And, you know, there's been a lot of outrage and confusion as to how somebody that was sentenced to murder and convicted of murder, such a high-profile case, is now eligible for parole. But it's very clear in our parole system here in South Africa how it works. And after you've served more of your sentence, half of your sentence, you are eligible. And this is why the parole board needs to consider all of this.
But also, Heidi, I assume, and we're showing the viewers, we were just showing the viewers a few seconds ago, for instance, you know, the fact that there's also a victim impact report, which is what you were explaining to us in terms of Reeva Steenkamp giving her version or her testimony today. And you mentioned something quite important, that they feel as though he hasn't told the full truth, especially because his version, a spanner in the works, was thrown in there after he was found guilty of murder, you know, when it was overturned from culpable homicide. So did Sinabako Nxumalo explain to you how much of, you know, how crucial the victim impact report is going to be in the review board's decision?
Yes, very crucial. I think all reports will be crucial in the decision that will be made by the parole board, but it's imperative for the victim impact report to be before the parole board. So what we do know, according to Tanya Kuhn, who represents the Steenkamp family, is that written representations were made as well as oral representations. This is why we saw Reeva Steenkamp arriving here at the Correctional Service Centre, going inside and sitting before that parole board. Of course, it's a very overwhelming process, but a very necessary process, because their side of the story needs to be heard, their version needs to be heard, and they need to give their version of why they oppose parole. So Sinabako definitely explaining how this is part of the parole process and how the victim reports is crucial in all this. Unfortunately, the victim in this, which is Reeva Steenkamp, is no longer here, but her mother definitely making those representations on behalf of Reeva and being that voice, and also on behalf of Reeva's father, Barry. We do know that he's not well at all, and parts of the representations that were before the parole board were from June Steenkamp as well as Barry Steenkamp really fighting for their decision to say that they do not want Oscar Pistorius to be released on parole because they feel he has not been rehabilitated, because he has not been truthful from day one, despite him being on trial and being given many opportunities, according to the Steenkamp family, to really tell them why their daughter was murdered.